nobody has claimed that Operation Sindoor has deterred them or solved the problem. Nobody in any position of responsibility. What you have done is impose costs on them for what they have done. And it's one of the costs. The military attacks on them, on their infrastructure and on their leaders is one of the costs. But there are other costs that you will also impose. Now,
let me just clarify my understanding. Your position is that Operation Sindoor hasn't deterred, but it's imposed costs.
Yes, exactly.
And you think that those costs are sufficient to make the Pakistanis or to make the elite in the Jaish think 2 or 3 times before they do something similar again?
It will make them think again. You will have to manage the problem. What I'm saying is very simple, that as the way Pakistan is constituted today, it doesn't seem to me that you have a solution to this problem available. What you can do, therefore, is to manage the problem. And that's why I mentioned mowing the grass. You will have to deal with it, and depending on the circumstances, you'll choose which tools to use.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. 1 month through the day a ceasefire paused Operation Sindoor, we look back on the momentous events of the last 6 weeks. Has Operation Sindoor deterred Pakistan? Or is it the case that terrorism is hardwired into Pakistan and cannot be controlled by military force? Was it wise to send delegations of MPs around the world, or has that furthered the internationalization of Kashmir and the rehyphenation of India and Pakistan? Is Prime Minister Modi's new doctrine of deterrence a wise response to terror, or does it restrict India's options and tie its hands in advance? Finally, is the challenge of a possible two-front war already upon us? Those are the issues I shall raise today with someone who's uniquely qualified to address them. He's a former High Commissioner to Pakistan, a former ambassador to China, a former Foreign Secretary, and a former National Security Advisor, Shivshankar Menon. Mr. Menon, in your book Choices, you write that after initially believing that 2611 required immediate, visible retaliation, you then changed your mind. You write, on sober reflection and in hindsight, I now believe that the decision not to retaliate militarily and to concentrate on diplomatic, covert, and other means was the right one. Does that also apply to the Pahalgam terror attack? Or do you now believe Operation Sindoor was warranted and justified?
In the same book, The Choices, I had also said that if there were another terrorist attack, no government of India would be able to resist responding kinetically with the use of overt military force against another similar terrorist attack or something of that was serious enough. Because it seemed to me that those circumstances in that particular time was unique. And we used it also in a unique way, but it didn't seem to me that it was replicable. Because I think the fundamental question that faces you is, do you think that you can change Pakistani behavior or not? If you think, and you yourself said this, is terrorism hardwired into Pakistan the way it's structured today? If you think you can change their behavior, then the response in 2008 was correct. And there was hope at that stage of trying to see, because we were in the midst of a peace process which had made progress. In fact, that's precisely why Mumbai happened, the Mumbai attacks happened. But once it became clear that terrorism seemed built into the Pakistani structures of state, or at least of the army, I think a kinetic response is inevitable. But the goals you set for that response will vary, have varied over time.
I'll come to a critical issue.
So when you say, was Operation Sindoor necessary? Yes. Was it a success? That depends on what goals you think it was meant to achieve.
I'll come to that critical issue you raised when you asked the question, can Pakistan be deterred, in a moment's time. Let me, for a bit before I do that, stick to your book Choices. There you give 6 reasons why a response in 2611 by diplomatic, covert, and other means was the right one. 3 of those reasons, I believe, apply to Pahalgam as well. First, you say the terrorist attack from Pakistan would have been obscured. That's precisely what happened after Operation Sindoor. The narrative became about India-Pakistan conflict and the threat of nuclear war. Terrorism receded into the background.
I think the world now knows, after Mumbai at least, the world has accepted that the Pakistan army uses terrorism as an instrument of state policy, that terrorism is bred and originates out of Pakistan and has affected not just India, but has affected other countries around the world as well. But states respond to these things based not on logic and reason, but on their interests. For them, once it becomes an India-Pakistan conflict and not a direct terrorist threat to themselves, they see it as an opportunity to pursue their interests, to use it for whatever goals they want. And if Pakistan is useful to them, they will do what they can with Pakistan. If you are useful to them, they'll do you. But they don't look at it the way you and I do, as saying, oh, but here's a clear case of a terrorist attack. And they make a distinction between these two things. And there is.
Absolutely. And isn't that the danger when you launch a kinetic response to a terrorist attack? The attention deflects from terrorism, it focuses on the India-Pakistan rivalry, the India-Pakistan conflict, and then it blows up into the fear or threat of a nuclear war. And those
Not
are
really.
actually
No, I
narratives we
think
want.
you're overstating and confusing at least three things, if not five. But the fact is, there are no perfect solutions. This is not some engineering problem with a solution. This is a process. And there are only mini-max policies that you can minimize harm and maximize gain. And at different circumstances, you will have a different mix of things. Yes, the world will say, oh, there they go again. They've been fighting for 80 years, they're fighting again, and will use that for their interests. This happened to you in 1948 when you went to the Security Council. They didn't look at it as a case of aggression. They dealt with it saying, how can we make Pakistan useful to us? How can we make India useful to us? And it's the same thing today. This you have to take for granted, but you choose your mix of things, of options, because these are all tools, the diplomatic tool, military force, each one of these. If your goal is whether control of the narrative, these are all tools. And you choose a mix depending on the circumstance. 2008 is not 2024.
Let's then come to your second reason. You say an Indian attack would have united Pakistan behind the Pakistan army. Again, that's exactly what happened. An unpopular army was rehabilitated in the eyes of Pakistani public opinion, and the army chief was promoted to field marshal.
Well, the promotion to field marshal, he decided for himself. I mean, that I don't think is because of his popularity. But it's true. We managed for the time being by what we did on the Indus Waters Treaty, by holding it in abeyance, I think we've managed to the impossible, which is uniting Punjab and Sindh in Pakistan on water issues. I mean, for the time being, their dispute over the canals and so on seems to have receded. But that's why I said these are all factors which will operate in these various cases. But the mix of responses, what you choose to do, depends on how you maximize your gain. In 2024, once you've come to the conclusion that terrorism is hardwired into the nature of the way Pakistan is constituted today, what you're trying to achieve then is three or four things. You are trying to deter future attacks if you can, to the extent you can. You are trying also to make sure that you maintain control of the initiative. And you mentioned you sent delegations abroad. You're trying to show the world also that you as India are united in dealing with this. To the extent that you did destroy some terrorist infrastructure, that you did also manage to kill certain terrorist leaders, you have achieved something. But ultimately, this is, as the Israelis say, mowing the grass. The grass will keep growing. You'll have to keep going back and mowing it. It's not a permanent solution. It's a process.
Let's then come to that.
And in your case, it's worse than Israel because it's state-sponsored. It's unlike what Israel is dealing with.
Let's then come at this point to that critical issue you raised in your first answer, can Pakistan be deterred? You say, and this is the third reason why you were against a kinetic use of force in 2008. A limited strike on select terrorist targets would have had limited practical utility and hardly any effect on the organization. So let me now ask you upfront, do you believe Operation Sindoor has deterred either the LET and the Jaish or the ISI and the Pakistan Army to stand behind them?
I'll say this again, 2024 is not 2008. In 2008, you had an army chief and president in General Musharraf, who was willing to stand up in the Staff College in Quetta and say Pakistan's primary problems are domestic, they are not India. Today, you have an army chief who has just made himself field marshal, who says the precise opposite. In fact, you've seen the two speeches he made before Pahalgam happened about the two-nation theory and about the inevitability of conflict with India almost. I think you're dealing with a very different situation. Pakistan's polity is much more fractured, and the space and the strength of the jihadi tanzeems in Pakistan is much more than it was.
So are you saying that LET and the ISI can be deterred? Have you now changed your position?
No, that's not what I'm saying. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying the circumstances are different, so you will choose a different mix of responses. It's not today, whether they can be deterred or not is a judgment call at any point of time.
It's your judgment I'm asking for. What is
my
your
judgment, I don't have the intelligence today that I had in 2008. So I would be very careful about jumping to conclusions. In fact, I'm very impressed by people's willingness to jump to conclusions and make grand statements about Sindoor with very little information.
Let me quote what you wrote in your book in 2016. The LET will not be deterred by the controlled application of military force.
Correct.
Radical ideologies and religion cannot be defeated on the battlefield, particularly if they have state support, as is the case with the LET. All of that applies to the LET today. So
it's worse today.
I ask you, has Operation Sindoor, which is quite clearly the application of military force, deterred the LET in your eyes?
No, I still believe what I said there. But look at the situation today. Look at how different it is. The state which is sponsoring that is a very different state from what it was in 2008. It's a fragmented state. It's divided against itself. Secondly, the strength of LET. I still believe that a solution to this cannot be only the use of military force. Ultimately, terrorism has to be solved politically. And it has to be solved within Pakistan, by Pakistan itself. But there is no sign of that happening. If anything, the whole trajectory of what's happened in Pakistan since 2008 is in the opposite direction.
So my question remains, if you say ultimately terrorism has to be resolved by Pakistan, within Pakistan itself.
No, and you use political means.
Deter.
Who? It's deterrence and solving the problem are two different things. Deterrence, yes, the use of force imposes costs on them. Deterrence is ultimately subjective. It's in the mind of the beholder. And that's not an answer. I can't answer for the LET, whether they are deterred or not. I can't answer for the Pakistan Army. But what I can tell you is that by imposing costs, you are at least increasing the chance of some deterrence operating. And in this case, frankly, all the other considerations which might have operated in 2008 did not apply to the same extent, which is why I said at that time itself in choices that if there were another terrorist attack, there would be a kinetic response.
Let me put you the opposite viewpoint. It's been articulated by military analysts at Georgetown University like Akhil Shah, at Yale like Shivshankar Singh, and by the editor of Force magazine, Praveen Soni. They believe that not only has Operation Sindoor not deterred either the LET in Jaish or the Pakistan Army and the ISI, more importantly, it might have emboldened them because they believe they've come out on top. To what extent do you go along with that view?
I don't agree with that at all. I think what you've done is, and I don't think nobody has claimed that Operation Sindoor has deterred them or solved the problem. Nobody. in a position of responsibility. What you have done is impose costs on them for what they have done. And it's one of the costs. The military attacks on them, on their infrastructure, and on their leaders is one of the costs. But there are other costs that you will also impose. Now,
let me just clarify my understanding. Your position is that Operation Sindoor hasn't deterred, but it's imposed costs.
Yes, exactly.
And you think that those costs are sufficient to make the Pakistanis or to make the LET and the Jaish think 2 or 3 times before they do something similar again?
It will make them think again, because it's 3 things have happened. The boundaries, they can no longer take for granted the Indian response, because now you've broadened the range of responses which they've seen since 2008, 16, 19, and now 2024. And you have the line between conventional, subconventional violence has also got blurred. And you've shown a willingness, therefore, and a capability to respond, not just to terrorist attacks, but to actual conventional attacks, which is what the Pakistan army switched to after you had attacked terrorist infrastructure. They chose to escalate.
So what you're saying is that we have increased the costs of such behavior, and that will make the Pakistanis or the LET and the Jaish think 2 or 3 times. But the bigger, greater problem is one that you were talking about a moment ago. You wrote about it eloquently in Choices. And that problem is that you can't control the terror that comes from Pakistan. You say, I'm not so sure that it's any longer within Pakistan's capacity to stop terrorism now that it has so infected and become so entrenched in Pakistan's society and state. If we can't stop at the terror that comes, and all we can do is increase the cost, then we're going to be facing it continually each time Pakistan is mad enough to want to do it again.
You will have to manage the problem. What I'm saying is very simple, that as the way Pakistan is constituted today, it doesn't seem to me that you have a solution to this problem available. What you can do, therefore, is to manage the problem. And that's why I mentioned mowing the grass. You will have to deal with it. And depending on the circumstances, you'll choose which tools to use. And force is one of those options. And force is just one of those options. It's not the only option. It's not the one that's going to settle everything, but neither is, each of them, you'll have to use political, diplomatic, military, all these means.
But you're also saying that terror is a problem we're going to have to learn to live with.
I think we have lived with it. We have lived with it since 1947. Don't forget the raiders into Kashmir. Don't forget Operation Gibraltar in 65. We have lived with this problem, but the problem has metamorphosed. After the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan, it became an organized part of state Pakistan army activity. And it has since grown and metastasized. So you have lived with this for many years. You've also coped with it. You've learned how to deal with it much better than you did before. But it is a problem that you have to deal with. And
that's what you're saying.
And you have to manage it. But it's not an engineering problem. As I keep saying, there is no immediate solution in sight.
But that's the important thing. Because there is no immediate solution in sight, there is no cure. As you say, it's not an engineering problem.
There is a cure, but the cure, as I said, is not in your hands.
Let me finish. You're saying
what about me? Let me finish. I'm saying the cure is not in your hands.
Is it in anyone's hands other than Pakistan?
I think we can all help a cure.
How?
By encouraging Pakistan to cure itself.
How do you do that?
Well, I don't think, for instance, an IMF loan to them in the middle of the crisis is a good step.
But we couldn't stop it.
The world has to decide to stop it. You're not the IMF. You're not the world. As I said, the world will respond based on their interests.
But hang on a second. If we're entirely dependent upon the world helping us...
No, we're not. I didn't say that. I said we can help a solution. We can help a cure. We are part of the help. What we do matters greatly. But the world also has to help.
Beyond increasing the cost, what else can we do?
Well, exactly what you're doing. You use various covert means. You also convince the world. And frankly, the world, I think, doesn't need conviction and convincing anymore about the fact that Pakistan sponsors terrorism or is the source of a problem.
But the world is not prepared to act.
Not one country supported Pakistan after Pahalgam. What they did when they did speak
Other
was
than
about.
Israel, not one country actually blamed Pakistan for Pahalgam.
Well, that's what I say. Nobody wants to get involved in your quarrels with Pakistan. They've watched this for almost 80 years.
But you're
But
making
what
my
they.
point for me.
No, I'm not making your point. I'm saying something very different from what you're saying. I am saying that the world will deal with it based on their own interests. Today, whether they see Pakistan as a threat to themselves or not has changed.
But what you're
In
also suggesting is that
2008, they had just seen the London train subway attacks. There had been you were in the midst of a global war on terror, and many terrorist attacks in the West were traced back to Pakistan. So they were willing to isolate Pakistan. The action against the FATF, all that followed in the FATF against Pakistan, all that followed 2008. Today is a different situation. This is why I keep coming back to this.
the point I'm making is that the world may have changed to our disadvantage compared to 2008.
Which is a very different
Let me
situation.
finish. Let me finish.
I agree.
Pakistan got the IMF second or third tranche. It's got a further loan from the Asian Development Bank. The World Bank has given it 40 billion of loans over the next 10 years. President Trump, in his attitude and comments, has effectively rehyphenated India and Pakistan, something we didn't want, something that we've struggled against happening. And the whole Kashmir issue has been internationalized once again. So 2025 is no doubt different to 2008, but to our disadvantage.
I agree. The world has changed fundamentally. And in fact, the world's probably at a hinge moment right now, where many things have changed and things have become much more difficult for us. Not just in terms of dealing with Pakistan, because Pakistan makes herself useful to other larger powers and has done so consistently, charging strategic rent, and also negotiating with a gun to her own head, saying, stop me or else I'll shoot myself, basically, and otherwise we'll go nuclear. This conflict is going to go dangerous, and so on. But today, if you look at the world, because of the nature of the international situation, the changes in American policy, for instance, the changes in American polity, you look at China-US rivalry, all these offer Pakistan opportunities, which she has used to make herself useful.
So is it more difficult for us to tackle and handle Pakistani terror today than it was in 2008?
I think so. I think the world is a much harder place today.
Are we less successful than we were in 2008?
That is hard to say because you can't compare apples and oranges. And secondly, frankly, we know too little and we're too close to Sindoor to come to that kind of sweeping judgment.
Okay, let's move beyond Operation Sindoor. Let's put that to one side. Let me ask you, how concerned are you about two things that Indian diplomacy has effectively struggled to ensure don't happen? And both of them have happened. The rehyphenation of India and Pakistan, done very effectively by President Trump, and the internationalization of Kashmir as a potential flashpoint, which is what's emerged out of the Pahalgam and Operation Sindoor episodes. How concerned are you about these two?
I'm not really that concerned for two reasons. I don't see India and Pakistan as having been rehyphenated. There's no comparison between the two. I mean, we have an economy that's 11 times bigger than them. The rest of the world has interests, economic and political and geopolitical interests in India, which it doesn't have in Pakistan. If there's rehyphenation happening, it's our own people who are doing it, and we're doing it in our own mind by making so much of it. Of a couple of statements by President Donald Trump. I don't see this as actually being out there or being a real phenomenon. on Kashmir being internationalized, I think that's why the diplomacy was necessary. That's why sending those delegations of MPs to talk to the members of the Security Council. It's not coming up in the Security Council again. It came up after the status of J&K was changed, after we read down 311. But frankly, it's not a live issue internationally, and there's no international appetite to internationalize this except in Pakistan. Pakistan will try. They've always tried. They've tried consistently. They tried in the 90s. They tried through the 2000s. But there's been very brief periods when they weren't trying this. But even when there was an active peace process going on, they still mentioned Kashmir in the UN. They tried, but the world is not interested in this.
Tell me, in this context,
and we shouldn't, I think, obsess about this,
tell me
about either Pakistan or about Kashmir as an international issue. And the rehyphenation, frankly, is largely done by us in our own minds and in our own projection.
In which case, in this context, how do you interpret Pakistan's appointment as either the chair or the co-chair of key counter-terrorism committees at the UN Security Council? Is that an instance or an indication that we can't isolate Pakistan, something that we've been attempting to do internationally?
I don't know if we tried to do it. And frankly, the UN works by rotation, by geographic rotation and among the groups. And these things, I don't think really matter. I mean, if you think that that committee counts and matters, just think how long Lashkar-e-Toiba, how long the Taliban, etc., were listed by that committee, and what happened to them? Nothing. I mean, the Taliban, in fact, came back to power. So I wouldn't ascribe such importance. I think the problem here is we are confusing real outcomes on the ground with the theater of politics, which, okay, yes, it's almost 60% of politics maybe today. But these things, we shouldn't blow them up into things that really matter.
Okay. Let's come to the delegations that we sent abroad. There were 7 of them. They went to, I believe, some 33 countries. They comprised some 50, 51, 52 MPs. Some were sent to countries like Liberia, Congo, Sierra Leone, Panama, and Guyana. Was that really necessary? And in the case of America, Daniel Markey of the Stimson Center told me last week he thought it was unnecessary to send a delegation to Washington or New York because no one in America, he says, seriously questions the Indian standoff case. So how useful were these delegations, and was it necessary to go to Liberia, Congo, Sierra Leone, Panama, and Guyana?
I think the choice of countries, frankly, I assume that this is because of either the regional influence or their presence on the Security Council. There must have been criteria that have been applied in the choice. I was a bit surprised that they didn't go in the immediate neighborhood, in the rest of our immediate neighborhood. But that I assume that somebody applied their mind and did that. But was it useful to send them? Because the international situation today is harder than it was before. Again, 2008, we didn't send delegations abroad. We sent them after the attack on Parliament, and we sent them now. I think it was useful to convey to the world, A, that we speak with one voice across the political spectrum, whether it's members of the opposition and whether it's the ruling party, the ruling coalition, etc., all of them. B, I think there is no harm in taking your case to people. Because, particularly in this case, because I think you were a bit slow at the beginning of Operation Sindoor in the narrative, in the messaging, in responding to questions and coming out with facts. Very unlike what you did during Kargil, for instance, when you were out there every day saying what was happening, explaining things. I was abroad during this period, in the US and in Britain. And I noticed that the Pakistanis were first off the blocks with their version of what had occurred. And therefore, their version got much more coverage, much more play than ours did. And, you know, it's So I think it was useful to have people going out and talking about it. But I don't think they concentrated only on Sindoor. I think the delegations, as far as I know, in terms of feedback, they also spoke about the larger interests that these countries have in the relationship with India and how we can take that relationship forward. So I do think it was useful.
If you had been National Security Advisor, would you have also sent delegations to our neighboring countries? Countries like Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh,
I would have.
Burma?
I would have. I would have. I would have included them. That surprised me, as I said, that they weren't included. But, you know, there are other diplomatic channels, and I suppose there are other ways of doing that, of talking to them about it.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Against this background, let's come to Prime Minister Modi's new doctrine of deterrence. Its first element is that India will decisively respond to any act of terror, and in fact, Rajnath Singh, the defense minister, writing in the Times of India, says, and I'm quoting, any act of terror is now considered an act of war. My question is that wise? Or does it restrict India's ability to choose whatever may be the most appropriate response? In other words, does it tie down our hands in advance?
Well, decisive doesn't mean only military, right? Decisive could include various other things, political, diplomatic, etc.
But what
financial,
about not saying
etc.
any act of terror is now
Why
considered an act of war?
I would be very careful about handing control of the remote to the terrorists, because in effect, then you're handing over the initiative to those who want to make trouble. By saying they choose when we go to war, they will decide when we get into a conflict. I would be very careful about that.
So in other words,
but I assume that this is a statement meant mainly to project determination to the domestic political audience. This is the 60% of politics that's theater, I assume. Because I'm not sure that this kind of statement would be read as contributing to or seen as contributing to deterrence in a real sense. Because deterrence requires both clarity, and this is a very general statement, an act of war, what? But it also requires a certain ambiguity in terms of the scale and timing and likelihood of response. But it needs clarity on your capability and the fact that and that's what Sindoor did. It demonstrated your capability to hit targets in Pakistan when you choose to, even when they are alert and waiting for it.
So what you're saying to me is when Rajnath Singh says any act of terror is now considered an act of war, this is rhetoric. Don't take it literally.
I'm not sure what he means.
Determination.
I'm not sure what he means by saying that, because he's not saying what he's going to do. By saying it's an act of war, he suggests that we will go to war, but it's an implication.
Okay. I think your meaning is crystal clear. The second element of the doctrine is that India will not give in to nuclear blackmail. Military analysts like Shivshankar Singh say that this runs the risk of treating Pakistan's nuclear threat casually. Do you agree?
I don't agree at all. In fact, we haven't given in to nuclear blackmail in the past. There have been several occasions in the past, and we haven't given in to it now. I think the basic assumption you have to make here is that neither side is suicidal. And the use of nuclear weapons in our context with Pakistan would indeed be suicidal, certainly for Pakistan. So if you make that assumption, and if that assumption holds, unless you assume they really want to commit suicide, then I don't think it's irresponsible to say we will not give in to nuclear blackmail. We never have, we won't in the future. What's wrong with that?
Okay. The third element of the new doctrine.
Are we supposed to say the opposite? I mean, I don't understand the criticism, frankly. Are we supposed to say we will give in to nuclear blackmail? No, obviously not.
I think the argument is that India needs to not talk about the issue at all.
Look, we've made it clear. That's why we have a nuclear doctrine. We made it clear when we'll use nuclear weapons, in what circumstances, that we won't use them first against a non-weapon state. But we've also made it absolutely clear when we'll. That's why I say deterrence requires some clarity on capability and on intent, but some ambiguity about the precise scale and timing of response. And that's exactly what you've done in the nuclear case. I don't see anything wrong with saying that we will not give in to nuclear blackmail.
The third
Because Pakistan is the boy who cries wolf and who keeps using this nuclear, the threat of the possibility of nuclear conflagration to try and get everybody else involved to, as you said, internationalize their issues.
The third element of the new doctrine is India will no longer distinguish between terrorism and its sponsors. Given that you believe terrorism is hardwired into Pakistan's society and polity and not just into the ISI, I take it this is something that you concur with.
I agree with it.
Except the problem is you may not distinguish between terrorists and their sponsors, but what do you do about the sponsors?
As I said, you do different things depending on the circumstance, on how strong they are, how weak they are, where their vulnerabilities are, and you choose your options depending on the circumstances.
In other words, you keep all your options open.
You use what works. But as I keep saying, there are only mini-max choices here. You minimize harm, you maximize gain. There's no perfect solution.
Which is why declaring every act of terror an act of war, even if it's only intended as defiant rhetoric, is slightly misleading because it's
I wasn't sure what
options.
it means. I'm not sure what it means, frankly.
Okay, that's perfectly clear. We're not sure what Rajnath Singh meant. Finally, let's come to the role China played in the four-day conflict. Do you share the view that Chinese J-10C planes and Chinese PL-15 missiles gave the Pakistan Air Force a significant advantage, leading to the shooting down of several Indian planes? That's been admitted. Perhaps 3, maybe 5, we don't know the number. But did the use of Chinese planes and Chinese missiles give the Pakistan Air Force a significant advantage?
This is an area which is still gray, when frankly nobody knows enough. At least nobody outside the system knows enough. And I don't know enough. I've been outside, not just outside the system, but I was outside the country when it happened. So I don't know enough to say. But you're absolutely right in pinpointing this fusion between Chinese doctrine and practice in the Pakistan army. I think this is something that needs to be looked at very, very carefully. For the last 10 years or more, the Pakistan army has been teaching Chinese doctrine and tactics at Quetta in their schools, in their training. And they've applied it this time. And to what extent the Chinese have always supplied the weaponry to Pakistan. That they've done consistently for many, many decades. But the actual use of it and to what extent China was involved in the actual conduct of Pakistani operations, all that we don't know. It's a completely gray area, and you're absolutely right. This is something very, very important and very significant. Because if this was so, then it matters. But to jump to the conclusion that Chinese weapons somehow gave Pakistan an edge and so on, we don't know enough. Nobody does. And this is where I'm amazed at the confidence with which people outside the system speak.
Now, both Sham Saran, a former foreign secretary like yourself, and Praveen Soni, the editor of Force magazine, are concerned about Chinese help to Pakistan in any future conflict. They believe the two-front challenge is already here. To what extent do you share that concern?
we've actually operated on the assumption of a two-front challenge since 2008. This is not some new idea, and this is why I say the level of fusion between the Chinese and Pakistan in these military operations, that is something really very significant and worth looking at for any future conflict, whether with China or with Pakistan. It's important that we get much more clarity on this. And this is something where I think, frankly, over time, we need to keep our eye on the ball. And I certainly hope that government also chooses to be more transparent in how it deals with this issue.
This fusion, as you call it, between Chinese equipment, Chinese doctrine, and Pakistani Air Force and Pakistani pilots, is that something that we need to urgently inquire into, study, and
certainly, I'm sure we've tasked the intelligence agencies and others to do so. I'm sure we've done that. But I don't think you or I are in a position today to come to definite conclusions on this.
But it is something that is of deep concern.
Certainly, it's very serious. This, for me, is the major lesson that we should be drawing out from this crisis.
To what extent can the lessons, when they are known, be shared publicly? To what extent would that be inadvisable?
There will be some lessons. There are certainly some lessons that need to be shared. And there is some learning, which I think, when the CDS said, for instance, that, there will be losses in conflict, but we have to see how we respond to them, how we learn from them. I think that's a lesson that the public needs to learn. And certainly the Indian media needs to learn, because I don't think the Indian television media, at least, did us any favors during this conflict. I was sitting outside and they actually made India look quite ridiculous.
In other words, they lowered the image and standing of the country.
They also made us less credible as a country, sadly, because there was a time when they were credible.
You're talking, I assume, about claims on Indian television that Lahore and Islamabad had surrendered and fallen, that the army chief had been toppled, that Karachi was under bombardment. All of that was just...
none of them stood to reason, and there was no evidence produced. And it was sad. I mean, I really found it sad.
You mentioned earlier that India was slow on the narrative in the first day or so. The Pakistanis were faster off their feet. Their narrative, therefore, was being reported by the Western media. To what extent were we hampered? Because in those first few hours, India allegedly lost planes. And that might have stopped us from going public.
You're asking me to read minds here, Karan. I can't read the minds of what. I think people were busy and I think it slipped their mind. I don't know. I really don't know.
But that's another lesson.
That's a lesson.
Mr. Menon, thank you very much for the time you've given me. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and your analysis, not just about Operation Sindoor, but how Operation Sindoor compares with earlier operations when you were National Security Advisor and Foreign Secretary. And I'm grateful to the time you've given. Many thanks indeed.
Thank you, Karan. Thanks for having me. Thank you.
A pleasure.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.